All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I am currently in Tools and Testing, and we're talking cross-browser testing. In the last video, we talked about handling some common HTML and CSS problems, and now we're going to talk about handling some common JavaScript problems, including using polyfills, and getting modern JavaScript features to work in older browsers. All right, I love this. The trouble with JavaScript. Historically, JavaScript was plagued with browser compatibility problems. Again, that was back in the days of the browser wars. They persisted well into the 2000s. And it says this is one of the many reasons why libraries like jQuery came into existence. What's interesting is jQuery probably 3 or 4 years ago was used in, I can't give you a number, but if you told me 75 to 90% of all websites, I'd believe you. Today, what people, JavaScript is becoming such an island into and of itself that rather than using a library like jQuery, most people recommend don't use jQuery, but use vanilla JavaScript because it's so strong and it'll do virtually anything that you want it to do. All right. So as it says, modern browsers do a good job of supporting classic JavaScript features. These days, most browser JavaScript problems are seen when poor quality, as it says, basically when you don't follow the rules. How's that? All right. Or when developers make use of new features in their code and they don't work in older browsers. All right. As said in the previous article, make sure your code is working generally before you go on to concentrate on cross-browser issues. There was it says if you're not already familiar with the basics or troubleshooting JavaScript, that was an article we went over earlier. There are a number of common problems that you want to be mindful of, such as syntax problems. The good news is typical syntax problems will be found by the system itself. All right. Now, logic problems, not so much. Make sure variables are defined in the correct scope. We've talked about this using let as opposed to using var, etc. Confusion about the term this. This is a JavaScript keyword, and it typically applies to whatever object or whatever you're working currently with. Incorrectly using functions. For example, bad for loop examples. There are hundreds of examples out there, and we all do it. We have all written code that we've gone back to later and said, my gosh, how did I write this? I did it such a poor job. Making sure asynchronous operations have returned before trying to use the values. And we've talked about AJAX and async in the past, promises, etc. I'd strongly suggest you look at this article, Buggy JavaScript Code, the 10 most common mistakes JavaScript developers make. If you haven't made them yet, you just haven't been programming long enough. All right, we talked a little bit about linters. And again, there's JS hint, ESLint, etc. There's a lot of these out there. Code editors quite often, as it says, have different plugins to try to help you with things. Going back again to the browser development tools. And we have talked again about using the console to do certain things and to do testing. When you do all that and you go into the inspect and you go into the console, all right, and again, this is their code. That's why I'm getting these errors. They're not my errors. But again, I can, even in here, I can type in 4 times 5 and it gives me 20. That's not a problem. I can write little things in here. So I can write an alert. Hello. And there it is. I can write a confirm. Let keep going equal confirm. Are you sure you want to continue? And there's what I get. So I can do some coding right in here, but other things that I can do. So let's pretend for a second this was my code right here that was failing. I can come in and I can set what are called breakpoints in the code, which tells the code, hey, when you come to this line of code, stop running. So I could search and see what kind of values and hopefully figure out what the problem is with the code. I'm not sure what happened there, but it was something I did. Here we go. All right. So the console API is what I've mentioned to you already using console.log. There's also a console.error that you can use. All right. All right. The JavaScript debugger. Well, there's something similar, not just in Firefox. All right. As it says, similar tools exist in Chrome, Safari, etc. Here's the one that's in Firefox. And as it says, when you do this on the left, you can select the script you want to debug. In the middle, it shows you the script itself. And on the right, it shows you some details. So you can go in and you can kind of walk your way through the script. As it says, the main feature of such tools is the ability to add breakpoints. These are points where the execution stops and you can examine what's going on. Typically, you go and you click in here to the left of where these numbers are, and it's called the gutter area, and you set a breakpoint then, and it will stop. All right. As your apps get more complex and you start to use more JavaScript, you may start to run into performance problems, especially when viewing apps on slower devices. Before we go into this, just to show you too, you might think, man, you're walking through this quickly. But in one of the books that we use, the Muroc book that we use, the JavaScript and jQuery, I think it's chapter 5 in here. Could be wrong, of course, but how to test and debug a JavaScript application. And it goes through how to use the developer tools, other debugging mechanisms. So you will come across this again. All right. As your apps get more complex, as it says, and you start to use more JavaScript, you may run into performance problems. Some quick tips. To avoid loading more JavaScript than you need, bundle your scripts into a single file. Make your files even smaller by minifying them. We've talked a little bit about some of this stuff in the past. When using APIs, make sure to turn off the API features when they're not being used, as they can be processing pigs. Animations can be costly. Don't use them unless there's really a need to do so. All right. Some cross-browser JavaScript problems. They're going to break the rest of this down into modern core features, modern web API features, bad browser sniffing code, and performance problems. All right. As it says, JavaScript is not as permissive as HTML and CSS. If the JavaScript engine encounters mistakes, more often than not, it will throw errors and stop your program from running. As mentioned here, there are a number of modern features that won't work in older browsers. ECMA, again, is the European Computer Manufacturing Association, and a lot of times things before ECMA 6 will not work. Things like promises, arrow functions, strict mode. We haven't even talked about that. But again, JavaScript is one of the most forgiving programming languages I've ever seen. If you want to make it be a little less forgiving, you can put using strict up at the top of your program. Then it'll make sure, for example, your variables have been declared before you start using them, etc. All right. It says there are many new APIs appearing in recent browsers which will not work in older browsers, and those are some of them. Some of these we've hit on. We looked at the IndexedDB, we talked about web workers, etc. Feature detection, as it says, the idea behind feature detection is that you can run a test to determine whether a JavaScript feature is supported in the current browser, then conditionally run code to provide an acceptable experience if for some reason it's not supported. And they give a geolocation example here. Libraries. JavaScript libraries are essentially third-party units of code that you can add to your program. They tend to come in different varieties, such as utility libraries, which provide a lot of functions. I mean, jQuery is a utility library. Convenience library to make it easier for you to do things. Effects libraries, a lot of times with animations. UI libraries, and we've already started to look at, really, I look at React as kind of being a UI library. Normalization libraries, as it says, they give you a simple syntax that allow you to complete a task without worrying about browser differences. JavaScripting.com gives a good idea of just how many JavaScript libraries are out there and are available. Polyfills we've talked about already. As it says, they're third-party JavaScript files you can drop into your project, but they differ from libraries. Whereas libraries tend to enhance functionality, polyfills provide functionality that doesn't exist at all. They use JavaScript or other technologies to support a feature that a browser doesn't support natively. So in other words, in the example they give here, ES6 promise is a polyfill that you can use so that promises that are not supported in earlier browser versions will at least either degrade gracefully or give a minimal amount of support. There's others as well, and some of them are shown here. Another option that's become important in the use of modern JavaScript is known as transpiling. As it says, it converts code. It makes use of ECMAScript 6 and ECMAScript 2015 features to a version of code that will work with older browsers. Webpack is an example of something that you can use to do things like this. And not even Webpack, I think I meant Babel, but okay. Finally, bad browser sniffing code. As mentioned there, all browsers have a user agent string, and that will tell you the browser you're using, the operating system you're using, the version of the browser you're using, etc. And some people use that and they create what's called browser sniffing code, all right, to see whether or not something will or will not work. Finally, handling JavaScript prefixes. Again, we talked about the mods and the other stuff in the past. All right, and ideally the day is going to come sooner and not later where this isn't going to be any kind of issue. All right, it says there are many other issues. You might want to consult the HTML and CSS finding help section for more advice. All right, so we're about halfway through here. We'll come back and talk about accessibility issues in the next video.